Hello, everyone. Welcome to Spooky Sunday. I know I said this is going to be on Saturdays, but it's looking like Sunday's a little more plausible. Today we're reacting to this psychological experiment called the Monster Study. I know a little bit about this study. I covered it in a class that I had. I feel like I can add a little more to it. And then if this video doesn't address everything, I have a little more to add to it. This is a video by TheEniqma channel and their video in the description. Please go like, comment, subscribe. They put in a lot of effort.
For a more lengthy discussion about this topic can be found in the Enigma's podcast. Link in the bio. In 1939, a study was conducted in Iowa Davenport involving 22 orphans. The objective was to induce stuttering in normal-speaking children and to see whether telling stutterers that their speech was fine would help them recover. What was well-intentioned in the first place turned out to be one of the most
Debatable.
unethical studies ever conducted in the field of psychology.
It was
which
very,
caused
very
a
unethical.
lifelong trauma to
I
the
wouldn't say
participants of the study.
It's debatable on the most one. There's
the
been
end,
a lot of bad.
The study was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it was bitterly dubbed as the Monster Study by the participants themselves.
Yeah, so okay. I'll see if he talks a little bit about the person conducting the experiment. But if you don't know, this was at a university master's program. So you normally have in doctorate and some master's program one head leader in whatever topic. If you look into a lot of like scientific topics, you have normally like one or two authors that are talking about this one topic. So in stuttering pathology stuff, they were trying to figure out what causes stuttering, and this guy, Wendell Johnson, was a very big proponent on this type of theory. Children can learn to stutter from somebody pointing out and over examining any repeated speech patterns. So like when babies start talking, instead of just going like da da, they go like, instead of just doing it once, they repeat it. So it's da da da. So there's like this kind of normalized repetition, and his theory was that if you bring awareness and think about these normal repetitions as being a stutter, the parent will start telling the child more out of fear, and then the child will internalize that and then overthink and start developing a stutter. So a lot of these students really respected Johnson and we didn't know about this study for a couple of years. And like you said, it was never published.
The study was conducted by a graduate student, Mary Tudor, under the supervision of Wendell Johnson, who was a distinguished speech expert from the University of Iowa. Since the Monster Study was conducted during the wake of the human experiment by the Nazis during World War II, the experiment was kept hidden for fear of Johnson's reputation. Because the study was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, Tudor...
Yeah, so also looking at the time period, if you don't know, a lot of experimental ethics came after World War II because of things like the Nazis. So that's when, after the Geneva Convention, they agreed on what's called the Big Four, which any medical field has to agree to, where you don't go after vulnerable populations, so that's like justice, do no harm, do the most good, and patient autonomy. And those you see really widely discussed in medical ethics. So doing a very unethical study, because this study was in 1938, so like right before, this would have been like what, like right during the invasion of Poland, right? It was in 38, if I remember. By the time this game published, you're going to hear about concentration camps, and you're going to be scared about your reputation, and all these students are going to also fear like their jobs and stuff like that. So they're not going to disseminate and talk about the thing, which is like not good. Very not good. And that's not to say that after World War II, we stopped doing unethical experiments. Even stuff like in the early 2000s has a lot of unethical experiments, which is why if you're ever a participant in any study, make sure to advocate for yourself. And there is a lot of safeguards. Yeah, just make sure if you're doing any study and something feels wrong to tell the experimenters.
Thesis, the graduate who conducted the study is the only official record of the details of the experiment. Despite its controversy, Patricia Zabrowski, University of Iowa Assistant Professor of Speech, Pathology, and Audiology, believed that the study has the largest collection of scientific information on the phenomenon of stuttering, as Johnson was the first to discuss the importance of the stutterer's thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and feelings, which continues to influence views on the stuttering greatly. In 2001.
So that is a good thing to point out. You will see like people commonly talk about the reason why we know so much about the human body is because of these unethical experiments that were conducted in like the 1940s by Nazis. Yes, we can gain more scientific knowledge. Obviously, the way that it was conducted and found was deplorable and horrible. And the reason why certain things like psychology especially, we can't make any causational claims, we can only hypothesize, is because testing it inherently brings about questions of ethics. So people who were victims of child abuse tend to grow up and become child abusers. Now, we can't say that if you're abused as a child, it can cause you to be a future abuser, but we can see that there is a high correlation. The way you would test causation is by controlled randomized experiments where you would have children who aren't abused as children abused, which obviously you can't ethically do that, you know? So that's why it's really hard to make wide and absolute claims in science. It's especially hard for any psychological thing or thing that you don't really test the results by any like biometric data, like any empirical measurement, you know? It's more based on like observed behaviors and stuff like that.
The University of Iowa publicly apologized for the monster study.
So think about that, chat. This study was done in 1938. The University of Iowa did not, one, publish or even talk about it. The only reason we know about it is because of one student who was the lead person conducting the experiment under Johnson. It took them like 60 years to apologize. More than 60. Insane.
None of the participants were told of the intent of the research, and they believe that they were there to receive speech therapy. The study involved 22 orphans, which consisted of both stuttering and non-stuttering from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home. They were divided into two groups, where one of the group was praised for their speech, whilst the other group was progressively showing symptoms of stuttering, and correction had to take place immediately. The experiment symptoms of stuttering from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home. They were divided into two groups, where one of the group was praised for their speech, whilst the other group was progressively showing symptoms of stuttering, and correction had to take place immediately. The experimental period lasted from January until late May in 1939, and the actual intervention consisted of Tiwtter driving to Davenport from Iowa City every few weeks and talking with each child for about 45 minutes. She followed an agreed-upon script. In her dissertation, she reported that she talked to the stuttering youngsters who were going to be told that they did not stutter. She said, "You will outgrow the stuttering, and you will be able to speak even much better than you are speaking now. Pay no attention to what others say about your speaking ability, for undoubtedly, they do not realize that this is only a phase." To the non-stuttering youngsters who were to be branded stutterers, she said, "The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You have many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Do not ever speak unless you can do it right. You see how so-and-so stutters, don't you? Well, he undoubtedly started this very same way."
Yeah. So, okay, first off, I want to point out one thing. These were all orphans. There was no one to advocate for them. No parents to be like, no, I don't want this. A lot of kids also think that scientists do no wrong and stuff like that. Also, there has been claims, it's debated on how true these are, but some believe, I can't find a good source for this. It was mentioned in my college class by my professor that if you think about it, some of these kids could think that by doing these studies or experiments, they could be more desirable and thus be adopted, which is pretty unethical to, you know, be very coerced into a study. That is highly unethical. There's a lot of practices now of trying to do certain things. This is why things like, one common example is like, you can't advertise for collecting blood or buying plasma in certain low income neighborhoods because they're more likely to. You can't just like use people who are financially at a loss to basically be vampires, you know? So that's goes back to justice and making sure that what you're doing is ethical, which in this case was very not.
All the children's schoolwork fell off. One of the boys began refusing to recite in class. The other, 11-year-old Clarence Pfeiffer, started anxiously correcting himself. Tudor reported, "He stopped and told me he was going to have trouble on words before he said them. She asked him how he knew. He said, 'The sound wouldn't come out. It feels like it's stuck in there.'" One of the participants, Mary Kurlaski, a 12-year-old, grew withdrawn and fractious. During their sessions, Tudor asked whether her best friend knew about her stuttering. Kurlaski muttered, "No." "Why not?" Kurlaski shuffled her feet. "I hardly ever talked to her." 2 years later, she ran away from the orphanage and eventually ended up at the rougher industrial school for girls, simultaneously escaping her human experimentation. Mary Tudor herself wasn't untouched. 3 times after her experiment had officially ended, she returned to the orphanage to voluntarily provide follow-up care. She told the branded stutterers that they did not stutter after all. The impact, however well-meaning, was questionable. She wrote to Johnson about the orphans in a slightly defensive letter dated April 22, 1940. "I believe that in time, they will recover, but we certainly made a definite impression on them."
There's been a lot of talk about Mary Tudor. Obviously, since all the information we know was from her, she can paint herself in a better light. She kind of claimed that this was something that Johnson pushed on her, that she wouldn't be able to get her master's unless she continued the experiment, where there was reports of her after, the start of seeing results, because they saw like pretty promising results and like could tell like, okay, these kids are developing a stutter after literally a month Obviously, that was reported by Tutor. She could just be saving face. One thing that people commonly use to defend Tutor is after the experiment finished, she continued seeing the kids and tried finding ways to improve their speech, and basically undo all the damage they did. Was not successful, unfortunately. And that could be her, being forced by Johnson and her not wanting to do the experiment and then feeling guilty, or just her trying to save face or feel guilty. Regardless of how you feel about Tutor, it is noble to try and help. Unfortunately, many kids did not recover at all. Those were really strong testimonials of, you would see a lot of kids start responding in one-word answers, short answers, not talk, be very apprehensive to even start talking because they're like, I'm going to stutter. Very just hard to even deal with. Compensation.
On 17th August 2007, 7 of the orphan children were awarded a total of $1.2 million by the state of Iowa for lifelong psychological and emotional scars caused by 6 months of torment during the University of Iowa experiment.
Okay, so it was 6 months. I thought it was years. So that's 5 months where they, for sure, at least 5 months where they did not need to keep going. But yeah, no, $1.2 million for each of these 6 of the kids that probably had their lives ruined. Like, it's harder to get a job, it's harder to form relationships with a stutter, and that's not to mention the psychological damage of being scared to even talk, being very reserved. It's nothing. It's nothing, and it also was 60 years later.
The study learned that although
Almost
none
70.
of the children became stutterers, some became self-conscious and reluctant to speak. A spokesman for the University of Iowa called the experiment regrettable and added, "This is a study that should never be considered defensible in any era. In no way would I ever think of defending the study. In no way. It's more than unfortunate." Before her death, Mary Tudor expressed deep regret about her role in the monster study and maintained that Wendell Johnson should have done more to reverse the negative effects on the orphan children's speech. What do you think of today's topic? Do you agree that Wendell Johnson had no intention in harming the orphans? Do you agree that the result of the study should have been published either way, knowing that the study had important information in understanding stutterers?
Okay, I want to answer all these questions in a bit. I'm going to talk about a little more information, and then we're going to come back and answer these questions. But there were a few things that the video expanded on that I wasn't going to talk about, and a little more that I was going to discuss. So this paper by Franklin H. Silverman, you can, if you Google the monster study, it's going to be the first one that pops up by the University of Houston. It's free access. You can give it a quick read. It's 7 pages, which is nothing. The first thing is Johnson was known for the diagnostogenetic theory as to evaluative labeling, which is the tendency to evaluate individuals and situations according to names we apply them. So Johnson believed that once you label a kid a stutterer, guardian will treat them differently in regards to reacting to any primary stuttering or any slight mistake. As the mother does this, the child picks up on that and they start being tense and observe their own behavior. This summarizes that last section where this theory assumes, therefore, that a person could be made to stutter by having somebody diagnose his normal disfluency behavior as abnormal and by indicating to him verbally or non-verbally, directly or indirectly, that he should try to speak with less hesitation. So this is, as soon as they get labeled a stutterer and are communicated that they need to speak more fluently, then they start to stutter. That's diagnostogenetic theory. That's what Johnson was trying to prove. However, the beginning of this study, Johnson didn't have this theory. The start of this theory was under the guise of stuttering being due to the lack of unilateral cerebral dominance, which means that the left and right part of the brain were not used when speaking. I don't know too much about this. I'm not a speech therapist, pathologist. That's how I take that, is they don't use the left and right side of the brain. Left side is more used for words and left side is more pictures. So let's get into the actual study part. So in this, there was 22 students, but 6 of them received the being treated as stutters, even though they're not, and given negative reinforcement of you must try to stop yourself completely. This is the statement that they had, and I highlighted some of the negative things. So the first start is the staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. This is deception. Deception can be used. It has to get institutional review board approval, which has a bunch of people not only directly who are all involved with the study. You have to report any changes or anything you do to them before you even start the study, and if you change anything in the study, it has government officials, it has outside groups. If you're doing animal, it has like animal rights activists, a bunch of people and independent bodies that see and make sure that the actual experiment is ethical. At the time, IRB boards were not used. So deception, you didn't have to report. Now, if you use any sort of deception in experiments, you have to justify it as necessary for the experiment, make sure it minimizes harms, or if it has a great deal of harm, there's a process for that. And at the end of the experiment, you have to disclose what the participant was deceived upon, and also why. Like why they were deceived upon and the potential benefits that the study has. Highlighting some other stuff that is very negative. So your interruptions were undesirable. That's negative speech. You must try to stop yourself immediately. This is going to make the person more salient and conscious about their stutter or any hesitation. It's absolutely necessary that you do this, and don't ever speak unless you can do it right. Obviously, if you're a child and you hear this, you're scared. They also mention, you can see how name of child in the institution who stuttered rather severely stutters. Don't you? Well, he undoubtedly started the same way that you are starting. Very not, ethical. And then they told this to the staff and teachers, where don't allow them to speak unless they can say it right. And basically said, make sure that they call them out on any stutter that they have. These are the 6 findings that they had. Decreased verbal output in all 6 subjects, only spoke when they were urged to. Second, their rate of speaking decreased. So they were very slow and exact. They were very hesitant to respond, and the length of response was shorter, with 2 younger subjects responding with one-word answers whenever possible. Fourth, they were more self-conscious, not only in speaking, but in any situation. There was a high level of self-doubt. Fifth, they accepted the fact that there was something definitely wrong with their speech. Remember, these people had no stutters. No stutters. This is so unethical. 6, every subject reacted to his speech interruptions in some manner, hanging their head, gasping, and covering their mouth. Others laughed with embarrassment. In every case, the child's behavior noticeably changed. She concluded that her findings supported the hypothesis that evaluative labeling, so calling someone a stutter in this case, can influence behavior. While I cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that at least some of the students or the children became stutters, I believe that it's quite likely that they did for the following reasons. So this is Silverman talking and giving theories as to why he believes that these children were stutters. Because not too much information is known about the children. And at this time, because this paper was written in 88, so the university still hadn't apologized or given any compensation to the children. So this is just Silverman expounding some of the evidence that the children were stutterers. Now, he gives 4 reasons. 1, they all seem to respect Johnson and accept the diagnosogenetic theory. 2, Johnson formulated his diagnosis after the study had been completed. So this study obviously is very in line with the diagnosogenetic theory. And this kind of proved that. However, they never published it because they knew it was unethical. 3, Tudor visited the children and wrote letters to Johnson about them. If the children didn't have speech problems, why visit them? 4, Johnson did not publish the findings of the study, although they clearly demonstrate that evaluative labeling could influence behavior. It goes on to talk about sometimes that Johnson would mention a theory and not cite his findings or any backing stuff to support it. These findings provide strong evidence that diagnosing normal disfluency as stuttering can cause stuttering. The fact that 5 of the 6 children were considerably beyond the age at which stuttering ordinarily begins. That is insane. It's terrifying for, if we go back up here, we can look at the ages of the people who were in the experiment. 5, 9, 11, 12, 12, and 15. 15 years old and developing a stutter based on this negative response. This is why words and traumatic experiences are so impactful on your life. You can literally be made to stutter. 15 years old. That's like what? Freshman, sophomore year. The conclusion is the implications of this finding seems clear. Asking a child to monitor his speech fluency and attempt to be more fluent can lead to increased disfluency and possible stuttering. I'm just going to look quickly over the notes that I have in when I was taking the class, my research methods class, because we talked about this experiment, and see if there's anything that I'm still missing. Major problems: there was no respect for the orphans, not really given a choice, not informed to say no, pushed to do it to be adopted, harm and negative lasting consequences, disadvantaged social group used for the benefit of others. You'll see this in a lot of, especially early and even now, experiments where certain groups and classes in society seem to be experimented on more. That's all I'm going to say about that. So, let's go back to these questions.
Had no intention in harming the orphans.
No, because you can't conduct this study ethically if you think that this theory is correct. Either Johnson did the study knowing that the theory was wrong, which, like, why are you wasting all this money and resources to conduct an experiment you know is going to fail? Or he believed it could be true and know that there is a risk of these children developing a stutter.
Do you agree that the result of the study should have been published either way, knowing that the study had important information in understanding stutterers?
Yes, mainly because it would have backed some of the stuff that Johnson was explaining more, like the Silverman paper stated. There was a lot of times Johnson in later papers would talk about something and not offer citations. Also, it would have made it so these children were given a better chance of life and compensated and actually had an apology before 70 years after the experiment. So yeah, that was the monster experiment. Kind of bleak, kind of sad, very sad. Things to take away from this. 1, if you're in any experiment, especially psychological, but any experiment, there's been a lot of unethical experiments. Advocate for yourself. Know that you can pull out of the experiment at any time. You can ask the researchers any questions. This is not to dissuade you from being in any experiment. Just know that there are potential risks, and sometimes researchers do not have your best interests at heart. This could be from wanting to find results, needing funding, or any ego thing like needing to publish something big. It's not to say all researchers are bad. I know many researchers who are wonderful people. I get to talk to amazing people every week who are doing amazing things. However, you have to be careful. And also just know that there is a lot of things that we may know from unethical stuff. And it sucks that people did these things. I hope this was spooky enough. I know I talked more about ethics and justice, but the more I think about this experiment, and I've thought about it a lot over the year or two I've known about it, the more I think about just how deplorable this is and how much there needs to be more ethics going in. I could talk about some of the safeties that we have. That doesn't guarantee that there's no unethical experiments. However, there has been a lot of decreases in it, and that could just be we don't know that some of the research is unethical now, because it took us 70 years for us to know that, 40 years to know the monster study even took place. The only one that I can think of in recent time is the Wakefield one, where they tried proving that vaccines cause autism, and we talked about that later on, which that's another rabbit hole, which I won't talk about right now because I know that it's pretty sensitive. But just know that based on scientific data, there has been no link. Any unethical experiment has many positive and negative things on society, whether it be, knowing more things about the human body, knowing how stuttering develops, to propagating harmful and misinformed information, such as certain medicines are bad. I'll see you next Sunday for another spooky Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that I could add a little more to Enigma's video and talk more about this experiment, because I think that it is very important to know about this. I'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.